Olá, gente, boa tarde a todos que estão aqui para assistir essa terceira sessão da Conferência do Brazilian Studies Program. Esse ano a gente tem um tema que se chama The Real and Imagined Brazil, Examining Narratives of Dissent. E esse tema é para falar sobre a importância da gente discutir assuntos como fake news, o negacionismo, a polarização da sociedade, até chegar na discussão do autoritarismo. E a gente aplica um pouco desse estudo também para discutir trabalho, saúde e democracia. O meu nome é Andresa de Souza Santos, eu sou professora aqui na Universidade de Oxford e também diretora do Programa de Estudos sobre o Brasil, que é parte do Latin American Center, dentro da Oxford School of Global and Area Studies. E nós temos várias atividades no que a gente chama de BSP, Brazilian Studies Program, e essa conferência anual é uma dessas atividades que está acontecendo pela primeira vez online por causa da pandemia. Mas a gente está muito animado ainda assim, mesmo online, de estar discutindo esse tema sobre o Brasil. E eu tenho o prazer de apresentar, então, a minha colega, a doutora Catarina Hatzikides, que coorganizou todo esse evento comigo.
Olá, muito obrigada, Andresa. Professora Erika, Ana Carolina, David, Ariel e David, muito obrigada por estarem aqui hoje. Sejam todos bem-vindos. O meu nome é Catarina Hatzikides, sou antropóloga, pós-doutoranda na Universidade de Tübingen e pesquisadora associada da Universidade de Oxford. Estou muito feliz em participar da organização desse evento, que esperamos que estimule um debate importante sobre temas atuais e relevantes. Antes de introduzir nossos panelistas, eu gostaria de apresentar brevemente o tema da sessão desta tarde. O Estado é laico, mas o governo é cristão. Grupos religiosos na política entre a tolerância e a intolerância. Ele busca examinar como as narrativas religiosas e o conservadorismo chegaram a um crescendo na política brasileira. Convidamos os palestrantes a discutirem, entre outras coisas, casos em que a religião e a fé foram efetivamente utilizadas para criar coesão, muitas vezes negando direitos ou legitimidade a certos grupos.
Desculpa, vocês me ouvem bem agora?
Sim. Acho que talvez o David tem dois aparelhos.
David tem que fechar o
aparelho. Isso, perfeito. Agora acho que vai.
Pronto, eu ia exatamente apresentar o David Lehmann, o professor David Lehmann, que vai estar fazendo o papel de chair dessa sessão. O David foi diretor do Center of Latin American Studies na Cambridge University entre os anos de 1990 e ano 2000. Ele escreve sobre religião no Brasil já faz bastante tempo, e o seu próximo livro, After the Decolonial Ethnicity, Gender and Social Justice in Latin America, será lançado em 2022. Bom, mas antes de dar a palavra para o David, eu acho que a gente só tem alguns comentáriozinhos práticos sobre questões de tradução e fala.
Exato, então, só para dizer que os palestrantes terão cerca de 15 minutos cada para suas falas. Em seguida, David Lehmann apresentará algumas considerações e eles responderão brevemente antes de abrirmos para as perguntas dos participantes. Nossas intérpretes, a Iris e a Karine, farão interpretação simultânea do inglês para o português e vice-versa durante o evento. Portanto, caso deseje mudar o idioma do seu áudio, basta clicar no globo na parte inferior da sua tela. E para aqueles que estiverem nos assistindo no YouTube, uma versão dublada virá logo após o final dessa sessão. E, por fim, convido a todos a nos seguir nas nossas redes sociais usando @OxfordBSP. Então, David, muito obrigada novamente por estar aqui. Passo a palavra a você. David, desculpa, não David. David.
Obrigado. Não, muito obrigado. Estou muito contente de estar com vocês. E eu vou apresentar a primeira apresentadora, acho que é Ana Carolina, né?
Posso ir, pode ser, não tem
Ah,
problema.
não tem ordem
Sim.
fixa? Bom, bom. Então, bem-vinda, Ana Carolina. Você você é professora da USP, né?
Não, eu sou doutoranda da Fundação Getúlio Vargas e pesquisadora do Instituto de Estudos da Religião no Brasil.
Ah, do ISER, que é
Isso.
o centro mais importante, eu acho, de pesquisa sobre a religião e que tem uma história bastante longa
Sim.
já. Então, você é muito bem-vinda e pode falar durante 15 minutos.
Obrigada, David. Obrigada, Andresa e Caterina, pelo convite. E vou falar em português, para os intérpretes se adaptarem. E é um prazer estar aqui nessa conversa com vocês, num tema tão que nos envolve nós pesquisadores que estamos envolvidos com esse tema nesse momento muito fortemente, e no debate público brasileiro e internacional ainda mais. Então, eu vou usar aqui só como referência algumas notas para essa conversa, e se tiverem algum problema de áudio, me avisem. Acho que a gente vai partir, todos aqui um pouco partindo desse pressuposto nesse painel, que o crescimento da influência da religião no Estado brasileiro não é um debate novo, mas volta a ganhar visibilidade muito fortemente a partir da eleição em 2018 do presidente Jair Bolsonaro, não apenas porque ele teve um apoio histórico de um único segmento religioso, no caso o segmento evangélico, muito diferente da diferença que aconteceu nas eleições anteriores, não apenas porque ele mobiliza explicitamente uma identidade cristã mais ampla na campanha política e no exercício do seu mandato, mas porque a gente tem testemunhado uma conjunção de forças políticas e pautas conservadoras intimamente ligada a morais religiosas ultimamente. Então, dialogando com a proposta geral desse painel, quais são os novos elementos que a gente observa na relação de grupos religiosos com a política? Para responder essa questão, é importante a gente ter um olhar da história recente, e aí principalmente em relação a partir de dois ângulos. Primeiro, a partir da articulação de lideranças religiosas e lideranças políticas conservadoras presentes no Estado brasileiro, uma articulação que sabemos que hoje cresce e ganha maior operacionalidade, mas não podemos olhar apenas para a influência de evangélicos para entender essas relações. Um segundo ângulo é a partir da transição religiosa no Brasil, nas últimas décadas, e das nuances da presença, aí sim, evangélica na sociedade e na política. Nesse sentido, eu queria apenas recuperar com vocês hoje alguns dados demográficos, para a gente ter um olhar dessas nuances e dessa transição religiosa e desses acontecimentos recentes. E para uma análise da interface com a política, eu escolhi uma abordagem a partir dos processos eleitorais, e eu vou me basear nos estudos recentes do Instituto de Estudos da Religião, do qual eu faço parte, e nós temos feito mapeamentos e observações dos processos eleitorais, especialmente de candidaturas com identidade religiosa, desde 2010. Então, como nós sabemos, os evangélicos não inauguram a relação entre Estado e religião no Brasil. A Constituição brasileira reafirma a laicidade do Estado, mas esse mesmo Estado sempre manteve a Igreja Católica como um dos seus principais interlocutores, inclusive favorecendo esse grupo religioso em diversos atos administrativos e decisões públicas e políticas, seja nas idas e vindas da regulamentação do ensino religioso, nas concessões de isenções tributárias, no Acordo Brasil-Santa Sé, firmado ainda no governo Lula, dentre muitos outros exemplos dessa relação privilegiada com o Estado brasileiro, que reflete a presença marcante desse grupo religioso na sociedade brasileira. O que poderíamos chamar, então, de, entre aspas, uma ocupação católica do espaço público no Brasil sempre esteve, em alguma medida, naturalizada em função dessa hegemonia e da incipiente diversidade religiosa no país. A laicidade não era questionada nesses casos, mas a naturalização dessa relação começa a mudar com o crescimento dos evangélicos no Brasil. Como muitos aqui devem acompanhar, e nós que estamos mergulhados nesses dados acompanhamos muito fortemente essa transição, as pesquisas mostram uma ascendente diversificação religiosa no Brasil e um crescimento evangélico continuado. Os dados mais rigorosos que temos são do censo de 2010, os mais recentes. Então, em 30 anos, o percentual de evangélicos quintuplicou, né? Nos anos 80 nós tínhamos mais de 90% de católicos no Brasil, em torno de 6% de evangélicos, e hoje o censo indica chegando a 22% de evangélicos no Brasil e mais de 50% de católicos, e aí um crescimento também, um decréscimo do número de católicos e um crescimento do número dos sem religião. A cada censo, o Brasil identifica um crescimento dos sem religião no Brasil e de outras religiões que também vão participando aí dessa uma espécie de diversificação religiosa, mas no fundo com uma curva aí de católicos descendentes e evangélicos ascendentes no Brasil. E a adesão ao universo evangélico cresce em todos os estratos sociais, mas está predominantemente na base da pirâmide social, em áreas urbanas e periféricas. Estamos falando de uma população, em sua maioria, de baixa renda, negra e feminina. Vai se formando um cinturão evangélico nas periferias urbanas brasileiras. E essa crescente transição religiosa no Brasil, os evangélicos não se destacam, nessa crescente transição, os evangélicos não se destacam apenas por sua presença numérica, mas também pelo seu ativismo de fé. As pesquisas do Pew Research vêm reiteradamente confirmando e indicando que 60% dos evangélicos frequentam templos e oram diariamente, em comparação com apenas 23% dos católicos no Brasil. E os evangélicos também compartilham mais a sua fé fora dos templos. Então, estamos falando, portanto, de uma população que cresce e que é mais ativa e proativa em seus hábitos de fé, num país, até então, de maioria católica não praticante. Do ponto de vista do vínculo institucional, esse universo evangélico também tem nuances, e imagino que o Davi vai falar muito sobre isso também a partir do caso dele observado. A chamada Igreja Evangélica Brasileira, apresentada normalmente no singular, não é um conjunto homogêneo e uniforme. É um mosaico de igrejas e grupos com diferenças teológicas, modelos de governança, práticas. Inclusive, esse é um número que não se tem um número preciso da quantidade de igrejas e denominações evangélicas que existe no Brasil. Ela é muito diversa e está ligada ao DNA, obviamente, protestante, e essa diversidade que acontece na base da sociedade, não necessariamente ela está de identificação institucional, não necessariamente ela se reflete na política. Né? Na sociedade, o último censo identificou uma maioria de adeptos às Assembleias de Deus, são muitas Assembleias de Deus, com diferenças entre elas, e na sequência, em um segundo extrato, já os sem denominação. Os evangélicos, a população que se identifica com a religião evangélica, no segundo extrato de maior porcentagem, não se identifica com nenhuma igreja e nenhuma denominação. Depois tem um mosaico enorme de igrejas no seguinte, e as neopentecostais, inclusive, são as que não têm o maior número de fiéis, mas têm uma presença política, pública, midiática e de poder real muito forte. E na política, isso a gente vai poder falar isso no debate, na política, a representação no Congresso, nos poderes legislativo e executivo, isso se transfere. A gente tem uma presença muito grande da Universal do Reino de Deus e das Assembleias de Deus. Então, mas voltando, esse Brasil, entre aspas, mais evangélico, e, portanto, também é um Brasil com os maiores índices de homicídio no mundo, com o maior índice de desemprego médio da história recente e com o maior índice de descrença nas instituições do país. Então, nesse cenário, para a população em geral e também para a parcela da população do segmento evangélico, pautas como segurança pública e acesso à renda passam a estar fortemente no radar. O que as nossas pesquisas durante ciclos eleitorais têm identificado é que os fiéis e também os parlamentares eleitos do universo evangélico no Brasil estão conectados a essas demandas e a dinâmicas sociais que não dizem respeito apenas a elementos da sua identificação de fé. Ao mesmo tempo, são demandas que ganham abordagens mais punitivistas, de controle da ordem, da moral, de cuidado com a família. Família aí numa concepção única e não múltipla. Isso nos últimos anos. As forças da direita brasileira percebem esse clamor e se apresentam também como o campo que trará alternativas a esse cenário de múltiplas crises, medos e perdas. O que temos visto desde as eleições de 2014, mas mais ativamente em 2018 e agora em 2020, é um movimento duplo. O ser político que mobiliza o religioso para se comunicar com essas novas bases eleitorais, e os líderes religiosos que usam o espaço da política institucional para impor a moral do seu segmento como agenda geral. Então, se trata, portanto, apenas de determinados grupos religiosos buscando impor a sua moral para a totalidade da sociedade, via políticas de Estado, mas é também sobre as novas facetas do conservadorismo brasileiro, usando a religião para se comunicar com o povo, as classes populares, e criar vínculos simbólicos e afetivos com ele. E como isso aparece nas eleições recentes? Desde 2010, como eu disse, no Instituto de Estudos da Religião, a gente tem observado continuidades e mudanças no espectro das candidaturas que mobilizam identidades religiosas nos processos eleitorais. As candidaturas que adotam o título religioso na urna, por exemplo, têm crescido a cada ciclo eleitoral, ao redor de 10% nos ciclos eleitorais de eleições nacionais e 20% nas eleições municipais, ou seja, são aquelas candidaturas que levam o seu título religioso, bispo, pastor, irmão, irmã, para o nome na urna, para a sua identificação com o eleitor. Desculpe que minha tela apagou. Eu estou vendo vocês nem ouvindo. Isso, desculpe. Essas candidaturas têm crescido e elas se concentram mais, nos últimos anos, candidaturas de identidade evangélica. Mas essa identificação no nome, por si só, não tem garantido sucesso eleitoral. Além dessa identificação explícita na urna, a gente tem se dedicado muito a observar, e é um trabalho um pouco mais, que requer mais camadas, ao que a gente tem chamado de mobilização de identidades religiosas, né? Não só essas explícitas no nome, mas também tem crescido muito, e aí em 2018 a gente observa um crescimento muito grande de campanhas políticas e exercícios de mandato que mobilizam uma identidade cristã mais difusa, por vezes acionando linguagens e símbolos bíblicos, por ora mobilizando moralidades, pautas religiosas de forma ampla. Inclusive, tem anedotas das nossas equipes de pesquisa que no primeiro contato, na primeira abordagem, um banco de dados de candidaturas em 2018, nos parecia, num primeiro momento, que todas as candidaturas eram de evangélicos, porque o uso do léxico cristão, de simbologias cristãs, era forte, era muito presente, e depois você, obviamente, vai qualitativamente observando o posicionamento, os vínculos políticos, os vínculos religiosos dessas pessoas, e muitas delas nem religião professava, mas mobilizou muito fortemente, a partir de 2018, identidades religiosas e um léxico religioso, principalmente cristão, e a gente também observou a continuidade disso nas eleições municipais em 2020. Inclusive, a gente está finalizando os dados para publicar agora em junho. E então, além dessa identificação, e ainda nos ciclos eleitorais, se a gente olhar aí não as candidaturas, mas olhando as candidaturas, mas tentando, a partir delas, e das eleitas, desses universos, né? A gente olha o universo das candidaturas, e dentre essas candidaturas, quais têm êxito eleitoral, a gente, a partir daí, aborda os elementos motivadores desse eleitorado, né? Diferentes trabalhos, não só nossos, têm identificado, e a gente vai certamente falar muito sobre isso aqui, alguns eixos que mobilizam e mobilizaram fortemente essa base considerada religiosa e cristã, que é a defesa da moral, a defesa da família, como eu já comentei, pelo controle e pela ordem no campo da segurança pública, sempre permeadas por um forte posicionamento anti-esquerda. E esse elemento do posicionamento anti-esquerda, ele não é novo, se a gente olha candidaturas, principalmente do universo evangélico, desde a década da Constituinte de 88 no Brasil. Eu não vou entrar nesse histórico agora. Então, e essas pautas não são pautas e nem formas de reagir a demandas sociais, como eu já coloquei antes, presentes apenas no eleitorado de base religiosa evangélica. Também está presente em eleitores de diferentes matizes conservadoras, com ou sem identificação religiosa. São muitas as pautas, e a gente também vai falar sobre isso, e o colóquio aqui proposto pelo Centro já vai falar sobre isso nas próximas sessões. São muitas as pautas vinculadas ao que se passou a chamar de bolsonarismo no Brasil. Uma identificação não com a figura do presidente Bolsonaro necessariamente, mas com pautas do seu governo e defendidas por suas bases. Isso foi marcante na eleição do presidente em 2018, com transbordamentos para as eleições de governadores nos estados, como a gente observou, acompanhando candidaturas nos 4 maiores colégios eleitorais, São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Minas Gerais e Bahia, e esteve presente também nas eleições municipais no ano passado, como a gente também observou, aí a gente estendeu um pouco mais e pegamos 9 capitais, um pouco para também observar a região norte e nordeste, onde tem uma presença tanto dessas candidaturas como do segmento evangélico muito forte. Então, o presidente Bolsonaro não foi um bom cabo eleitoral, e nem um cabo eleitoral eficiente em 2020, falou-se muito sobre isso, no sentido de indicados dele não foram eleitos necessariamente nas capitais, mas as pautas que o elegeram continuaram muito fortes nas eleições de 2020. Como a gente pode ver aqui, eu só queria, que acho que também deve falar um pouquinho sobre isso, se eu puder, eu vou compartilhar minha tela aqui só para mostrar para vocês aqui, rapidinho, vocês me falam se vocês estiverem vendo. Conseguem ver? Sim. Então, aqui um pouco só, aqui um exemplo de 2 candidaturas a vereadores em Belo Horizonte, em Recife, eleitos. O pastor Júnior Tércio em Recife foi o 3º mais eleito de Recife. Um pouco para a gente entender aqui essas pautas, essas moralidades mobilizadas, né? Contra o aborto, contra a erotização infantil, cristã e conservadora. Ao mesmo tempo, entra na agenda que não é só a agenda moral ou agenda dos direitos reprodutivos, a favor do livre mercado, defensora da família, no caso do pastor Júnior Tércio, contra a política de drogas, cristão e conservador, contra o comunismo, contra a ideologia de gênero. Então, essas campanhas são apenas um emblema aqui do que a gente viu se repetir em muitas candidaturas, e aí não apenas de base evangélica, mas também de base católica, mobilizando essas mesmas pautas e esse mesmo léxico nas eleições em 2020. Outros 2 elementos importantes de continuidade nesses processos eleitorais e que nos dão um pouco elementos dessa relação religião e política, que a gente viu, a gente observou nas últimas eleições, nas 2 últimas eleições, foi, por um lado, o papel das grandes corporações evangélicas pentecostais e neopentecostais e sua incidência real nas eleições para os poderes legislativo e executivo no Brasil, e eu imagino que também a Ariel vai falar sobre isso. A Assembleia de Deus e Universal do Reino de Deus elegem e tem eleito mais representantes nas últimas eleições, tanto para os legislativos quanto para os executivos municipais. Por outro lado, e a gente também observou isso fortemente nas eleições municipais, cresce a articulação de políticos e candidatos evangélicos e católicos, com alguns exemplos emblemáticos nas capitais nas últimas eleições. Essa aproximação entre lideranças políticas católicas, evangélicas, conservadoras não é nova, mas ganha contornos especiais, especialmente a partir de 2010, em reação ao Programa Nacional de Direitos Humanos, o 3º Programa Nacional de Direitos Humanos, e as propostas de avanço no reconhecimento de direitos das mulheres e diversidade sexual. Eu imagino que a gente vai falar sobre isso hoje também. E é uma aliança que acontece no âmbito da sociedade civil e da política, e tem se expandido para outras agendas, como educação e segurança pública, extrapolando a agenda de gênero. Então, a reação, portanto, para terminar, dessas forças políticas de base religiosas a avanços no campo da conquista de direitos não foi o único vetor dessa virada do Brasil à direita, de alguma forma. Políticos, religiosos ou não, mobilizaram o religioso e suas formas contemporâneas mais individualizantes e dogmáticas como uma forma de apresentar alternativas que permitissem um retorno da ordem, da previsibilidade, da segurança e da unidade. O que a socióloga Cristina Vital, que trabalha conosco, vai chamar de retórica da perda, ou a cientista política Flávia Biroli vai analisar na chave da moralização das inseguranças. Então, para terminar essa fala inicial desse painel, fazendo esse panorama geral, eu gostaria de deixar para vocês essas 2 ideias, da retórica da perda e da moralização das inseguranças, para a gente conversar um pouco dessa relação da religião com a política hoje no Brasil. Obrigada.
Parabéns, muito obrigado, Ana Carolina. Acho que a informação que você forneceu deu um quadro muito claro do background e das tendências que estão sempre a mais em evolução. Então, agora vamos pedir a Amy. Are you there, Amy?
I am indeed.
Yes, Amy, I don't know whether to speak English or Portuguese, but since I'll introduce you in English. Amy is a professor at Iowa State, and she is the author of a very opportune book, which came out about 1.5 years ago, about evangelicals and politics in Brazil, which is unusual because it's based on long-term, detailed field research in a provincial, sorry, that is the noises of New York, in a provincial town of Juiz de Fora. And so she's give us further updated and interesting opinion poll data and her analysis. Amy, over to you.
Thank you so much, David. So I'm going to speak in English because I said that I would, and to make life easier for our interpreters who are working really hard, though it makes me feel awkward. So I'm going to speak in English, and I'm going to try to speak slowly because that's what the interpreters requested. I have a tendency to speak too fast. So I'm going to share a screen here. Okay, here we are. You guys are all seeing this, right? You all? Okay, cool.
Yes, we see it.
Okay, good. What's going on? You see the full presentation now?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on the slideshow. Okay. All right. So thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to be presenting today some work that's solo authored, but I'm also presenting some work that is co-authored with a couple of people from the Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, Mateus Ferreira and Mario Fuchs. And of course, my longtime co-author, Thie Boas. I'm also presenting a couple of different, some previously published work with him and some ongoing up and coming work with him as well. So you'll see a hodgepodge of things here today. In addition to, of course, solo-authored work. So I'm going to start off with two images from Bolsonaro from the 2018 campaign, where he's known to have been a highly religious candidate who attracted a religious audience. The two images that we see here, okay, the two images that we see here are the first, Bolsonaro's campaign slogan, which comes from a speech he gave in speeches. Actually, he used the same slogan several times in speeches, and this became ultimately his campaign slogan, Brasil acima de tudo, Deus acima de todos. And I'm going to contrast this with, okay, there we go, this image from Bolsonaro from the Marcha para Jesus in 2019. These are obviously both images in which he is mobilizing a religious base. At the same time, they speak to two different ways that he has tried to appeal to religious audiences. The first way that he has tried to appeal, and the one that we see in the first image, is him appealing to sort of what we might call a pan-Christian or an ecumenical base that includes both Catholics and evangelicals, where he is explicitly trying hard not to identify himself with any particular religious group, whether Catholic or evangelical. Bolsonaro has been extraordinarily effective at playing both sides of this, at portraying, at simultaneously identifying himself with evangelical and Catholic populations. He continues personally to identify as Catholic, while much of his family is evangelical. Many of his sons have converted to evangelicalism. His current wife, Michelle, is an evangelical. He's been baptized in the Jordan River and continued to identify as Catholic after being baptized in the Jordan River by the former presidential candidate, Pastor Vidal do Dias Pereira. And at the same time, in 2019, he attended the March for Jesus, which is identified very strongly with evangelicals. So he is simultaneously a Christian nationalist and identified with politicized evangelicalism at the same time. The other interesting thing about this image of him from the March for Jesus is that he is also associating his support for evangelicalism with his support for free access to guns, which is not necessarily a political issue that has been identified with political evangelicalism, but here he is personally linking these two issues, even if they are not linked in public opinion or in the public imagination. Okay, so going to start with the stylized fact that many of us know who observe Brazil and study Brazil, which is that evangelicals swung the 2018 election to Bolsonaro. Depending on which survey you look at, it seems that Bolsonaro may have lost the 2018 election in the second round if it had not been for evangelicals. Of course, you know, it's hard to imagine a counterfactual world without evangelicals, but there's at least some argument that he could have lost 2018 without evangelicals. And yet the interesting thing is, so we have here, these are two figures produced by Matheus Ferreira, a graduate student at UFMG, who is looking at the increase in support for Bolsonaro among evangelicals. So on the left-hand side, you see evangelicals. On the right-hand side, you see non-evangelicals, the rest of the population. Or actually, I'm sorry, it's the entire population. So we see that there was a rapid rise among both evangelicals and non-evangelicals, but the rapid rise among evangelicals was larger than the rapid rise among non-evangelicals. And this difference in the rise in support for Bolsonaro between evangelicals and non-evangelicals was arguably key to Bolsonaro's success, his 55% of the second round vote in 2018. This was highly unusual, not only in Brazilian context, but in the Latin American context. So this really complicated figure that I'm showing you all here is a figure from a chapter that Taylor Boas and I produced for the edited volume, The Latin American Voter, which was published in 2015. In the Latin American Voter, we find that there is no consistent correlation between evangelical Protestantism and voting for the right in Latin America. And in fact, in the majority of countries, evangelicals are not necessarily more supportive of candidates on the right than Catholics are. And we do find that there is some tendency of the non-religious to vote for the left and church attendance to be correlated with voting for the right, but not particularly a correlation between right-wing candidates and the vote. So the question is, well, what happened? And actually, I should say before I ask that question, we also find, and I'm going to review some evidence later, that this is the same in Brazil, that historically there has not been a strong correlation between evangelical Protestantism and voting for the right, even in Brazil. And lots of prior work, my own included, but by many other people as well, people like Simone Boyne, show that there has historically not been a correlation between these variables. So the question is, what happened? I'm going to argue that in 2018, two things happened that created this swing of evangelicals towards Bolsonaro. The first is sexuality politics. Sexuality politics became extraordinarily prominent in 2018, and this was in part the result of Bolsonaro's particular political brand. And then campaign effects took hold and led to sort of this massive wave of conversion of what we call conversion to Bolsonarismo among evangelical populations. Okay, so first, sexuality politics. This figure is a complicated one produced by me and Taylor Boas in an ongoing working paper, where we look across Latin America to try to explain under what circumstances do evangelicals tend to vote for right-wing candidates, and under what circumstances do they tend to vote for centrist candidates or even left-wing candidates. So what we find is that across Latin America, coverage of sexuality politics predicts whether evangelicals vote for the right or the left. So in times and places when sexuality politics, that is to say, same-sex marriage and abortion are really prominent in the news or on the legislative agenda or prominent in campaigns run by candidates, when those issues are hot on the agenda, we find that evangelicals vote substantially to the right of Catholics, and also that church attendance substantially increases voting for right-wing candidates. In times and places when same-sex marriage is not on the agenda, when abortion is not on the agenda, evangelicals often vote to the left of Catholics, actually, which is probably about their lower class base that Ana Carolina was talking about. And so we find that we argue, Taylor Boas and I argue, that sexuality politics is key to understanding a realignment of evangelicals to the right in some times and places. In Brazil, of course, we see this in some prominent fake news stories. These two stories, the first one is a story about Fernando Haddad, was that claimed that Fernando Haddad was going to forcibly take your children and decide what their gender are, what their genders are, which sounds kind of funny, but is really an alarming kind of fake news story if you stop and think about it. And the second is a story about, again, this, it's funny, but also alarming. If you think about it, as a fake news story about how the PT was distributing baby bottles that looked like penises in daycare centers, public daycare centers. So these kinds of stories circulated in, particularly in WhatsApp groups on the internet, but especially in WhatsApp groups, and were especially prominent in Pentecostal circles, which are the places where we find these kind of sexuality politics mattering most. And then the second thing that happened is campaign effects. We find, so this is from a panel study that I conducted with a number of other co-authors whom I didn't mention, Molly Cohen, Matthew Layton, and Mason Mosley. We conducted a panel study that was not focused on religion, but I'm analyzing the religion data from the panel study. This is a panel study. We show that between mid-September and the beginning of October, about 45–50% or over 50% of Pentecostals who did not originally intend to vote for Bolsonaro came around to deciding to vote for Bolsonaro in the end. Likewise, about 30% of non-Pentecostal evangelicals who said who did not initially intend to vote for Bolsonaro ended up 3 weeks later eventually voting for Bolsonaro. Whereas the rate of conversion of of Catholics and the non-religious and other religions were substantially lower. So there were campaign effects that led to conversion. The question is, what were those campaign effects? We argue, so going backward in time, so let me take this. We argue that that it's about discussion of the candidates in church. And this in part has to do with clergy, what clergy are saying. So going back in time, this is a figure presented in my own book, Religion and Brazilian Democracy, which was published in 2019 by Cambridge University Press. In 2010 and 2014, I asked in panel surveys, to what extent are you aware of your clergy members supporting any particular candidate? The word that's often used to describe the evangelical vote in those years was pulverization, which is to say that the vote was highly fragmented, extraordinarily fragmented. We see here that in 2010, about a third of evangelicals said that evangelicals who knew whom their clergy supported said that their clergy supported Dilma. About a little over a third said that their clergy supported Serra, but there was no clear tendency among evangelicals and Catholics. In 2014, we see much of the same. This is very different from what happened in 2018. In 2018, we find clergy and to some extent church members within churches, in evangelical churches, were largely united in support for one single candidate who happened to be Jair Bolsonaro. In the third wave of our panel survey, that is to say in mid-September, we asked people whom their clergy member, or if they heard discussion of the elections in churches, and if they knew whom their clergy supported. We find that there were very high levels, about 70% of evangelicals and Pentecostals heard discussion of the elections in churches, and almost everybody who knew who their clergy member supported said that their clergy members supported Bolsonaro. There were very few evangelicals and Pentecostals who said that their clergy members supported any other political candidate. And the same is actually true of Catholics in the 2018 election. So going forward, what can we expect in 2022? Drawing on the logic that we've gone through up until now, the answer is, who knows? The answer is to give a little bit more detail. That Jair Bolsonaro's campaign in 2018 showed, and the data that Ana Carolina reviewed from 2020 also confirms the power of sexuality politics as a campaign issue, as a means of campaigning. The issues that the little candidate ads that she showed us are, again, if you look at them, the candidates are talking about sexuality politics more than anything else. They're talking about being Christian, they're talking about abortion, and they're talking about defense of the family, which is code for sexuality issues, and they're talking about LGBT issues. LGBT issues are wrapped up in all of the coded language that they're using. So we can be absolutely certain that the 2022 campaign is going to feature these kinds of issues, and that these kinds of issues are going to mobilize votes along religious lines. Who's going to use these issues? How successful will they be relative to other issues? That's where the question is. And these are questions that will be related to campaign effects. Will there be a candidate? That's one question. Will there be a strong centrist candidate? That's another question. So the extent to which different candidates are able to highlight these issues will affect the extent to which Bolsonaro and other candidates on the right are successful in using these issues as in the campaign in 2022. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you so much again for being here, and I'm excited to hear the other presentations.
Well, thank you very much, Amy. That was excellent and gives us further. Can you hear me? No. Gives us further contextual and also data, and also some notion of where we will be in the next year. We're certainly going to be in a vicious campaign, though we don't know what the outcome is. I want to once again actually apologize to Ana Carolina for not introducing her properly. She is a researcher at the ISER that we were talking about. For those who don't know, is the Instituto Superior de Estudo da Religião, which is, as I said, a very important independent research institution in Rio. And she belongs to the Fundação Getúlio Vargas, where she is teaching and also a doctoral candidate. Now, next we have Ariel Goldstein. He is from Buenos Aires, or at least he is a doctor in social science from Buenos Aires, and he is a member of the Argentine research system, the Conicet, and he's an assistant professor in the University of Buenos Aires and has written books at Manchester University Press, and another book also about religious groups in general in the world. So we're going to get a more global view from Ariel. Ariel, over to you.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you very much. Thank you, Caterina, and also Andresa for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here. So I will share a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation about some things that I focus in my book about evangelical power. Now I'm going to share the screen. Okay, I will talk a little bit about the alliances between evangelical pastors and far-right politics, especially in the case of Brazil and the United States. That was one of the most important issues of my book about evangelical power, published the last year. I'm going to make some analysis of the main intermediaries, something related to what Ana Evangelista talked about, the evangelical leaderships and their importance in politics. They represent evangelical churches, but they also participate in politics. How these groups, special groups, influence the government, especially in the case of Trump and Bolsonaro, two radical right-wing governments that are democratic but put the liberal component of democracy in tension. And in this case, of these two cases, the association between religion and nationalism becomes a constitutive factor for the legitimacy of this kind of political process. And I say that evangelical power in these two cases is affirmed in two elements: their territorial expansion, especially in poor neighborhoods, and also their power in the media. They tend to obtain more money for the churches, and then this evolves in they buy some media where they make their call, so they acquire more people to the churches. So I'm talking a little bit about the US. So I have to say about the alignment that the Southern whites with the Republican Party after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In the 70s, there was the fall of the last progressive evangelical, that was Jimmy Carter, and the rise of Ronald Reagan. With the rise of Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party became very aligned with the Southern white evangelicals. And also there has been a historical relationship between the Republican Party and Israel. That's what explains the move of the United States Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem that Donald Trump made with the pressure of some evangelical pastors and groups, and also the opposition to the Roe v. Wade judgment, and also the opposition to the integration of the Christian schools gave rise to the birth of the moral majority directed by Jerry Falwell, the very important pastor in the 70s, that created that movement, moral majority, but that was very important to this alignment between the Republican Party and the Southern whites evangelicals. And also, Trump has been the only president in the March for Life, and he nominated Amy Coney Barrett for the Supreme Court, that she belongs to the People of Christ, that is a group that believes in miracles, and it's a Catholic but Pentecostal group that believes in miracle and this kind of practices. Here is Donald Trump on this image in the church Grey Jesus that is in Florida. You know, here is Guillermo Maldonado, that is a Honduran pastor, where they prayed for him and say that, okay, that God chose America to be the most greatest nation on earth. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about this relationship that Donald Trump has with the evangelical Christians, White. There is Paula White that was putting his hand on him on the last image. She belongs to the City of Destiny Church that is in Florida. She has been the spiritual advisor of Donald Trump on the White House. Also, Ralph Drollinger, it's another pastor that worked at White House and established important relationships with other pastors in Latin America. Also, we can say something about Ted Cruz. He's senator for Texas. He has relationship with pastors from the Republican Party. After, in the primaries of 2016, he was the most important candidate for the evangelicals. But when Ted Cruz put down his candidacy, Donald Trump transformed in the most important candidate for the white evangelicals. And also we can say about Mike Pompeo. He was Secretary of State. He had a fundamentalist vision of international relations. He said in a Congress, in an evangelical Congress, that being a Christian is the best way to represent the foreign policy of the United States in the world. Also, Mike Pence, he was governor from Indiana. He had a show on TV, and he's very close to very important pastors. And also, I have to name Pat Robertson, which is the owner of the Christian Broadcast Network, a very important media channel. And he was Republican candidate in the primaries of 1988. Also, okay, I will say something about Brazil. Bolsonaro, as Carolina Evangelista said, and also Amy, was present at the March of Jesus. He's the only president at the March of Jesus in Sao Paulo, the most important evangelical march in Brazil, I think. He has coordinated with the Evangelical Parliamentary Front that represents about 2,000 deputies and 8 senators. He raised the selling to declare the financial movements of the churches and allowed them to open during the pandemic. Also in Brazil, there is a phenomenon that is interesting, that is the Pentecostalization of Christianity. 1/3 of the Catholics and 2/3 of the Evangelicals are Pentecostal. So this is a thing that Flavio Soffiati, professor of the University of Goiás, has underlined, and is an important fact. But also the ability of Bolsonaro resides in his capability to build ties with different churches, not only one, the Bautista Atitude, the Assembly of God, the World Church, Power of God, and the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. So here he is in the March of Jesus with the couple Hernandez, that is from a church called Renacer en Cristo, Reborn in Christ. So I will talk a little bit about the most important relationships that Bolsonaro has. It's like the Casa Hernandez, the couple Hernandez, Renacer en Cristo Church, that organizes the Marcha para Jesús, the March for Jesus. Also, Marco Feliciano is a very important leader in the Congress of Brazil, and he manages the relationships with Africa, of Brazil with Africa, that it's a very important place where are expanding the evangelical people. And also Edir Macedo, that it's more known, he's the owner of TV Record, the most important pastor of the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. And also he has relationship with Marcelo Crivella. He was the mayor of Rio de Janeiro. Then is also Damares Alves, that she was advisor of the pastor Magno Malta. She's the Minister for Family and Human Rights, and she develops an agenda against the gender ideology, against what she calls gender ideology. And then also it's Yossi Shelley, that now has gone out of Brazil as an ambassador. He was ambassador from Israel in Brazil. He told in an interview that Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, told him, you have to establish a relation with evangelicals if you want to be close to the president Jair Bolsonaro. So he appeared in the March of Jesus, named by Bolsonaro, and in the center of the scene. So he was an important player in Brazil while he was ambassador. Then is Silas Camara, that is the coordinator of the parliamentarian front in the Congress. He's an important pastor from Amazonas, where the family Camara, the Camara family of the Assembly of God, they have a very important media also. They are the owners of some media in Amazonas. So to end, I will say that Brazil and United States are two models of success between evangelical pastors and far-right politics. They have their own media, the TV Record, that is the second in audience in Brazil after TV Globo. They have in the United States the Christian Broadcast Network, and also they have presence in Congress. let's look at this. In the United States, where we have a bipartisan system, they are more closely aligned with the Republican Party. But in Brazil, where we have a multi-party system, they have created their own parties, the Christian Social Party, and also the Republicanos Party that is very close to the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. Also, they have very important ties to the Trump and Bolsonaro administration, receive benefits and state resources, tax exemptions. And also there's a link, an interesting link that I will just say with the migratory phenomenon. In Brazil, we had a very important migration inside Brazil from the north to the south of the country at the middle of the 20th century. In the United States, one of the most growing communities is the Hispanic Evangelicals that are migrating from Latin America to United States. And also one of the biggest places where evangelicalism is growing is Central America, that has also expelled a lot of people that migrate to United States. So I think that we have to look close at this relationship between migration and the rise of evangelicalism. Also, we can talk about the participation in foreign policy with the Brazilian relations with Africa, where, for example, the Pastor Marco Feliciano is very important, and also with Ralph Drollinger, that during the Trump administration was very important establishing relationships with Latin American governments, such as the Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua and others. There is also a messianic view where the power is understood by these evangelical pastors and these far-right governments as a divine mission. So this puts in danger the liberal component of democracy, such as when we had the coup in the Capitol in the United States, right? Where people said that entered on the Congress said that Trump was in the Bible, and they prayed inside the Congress. So another issue to end this presentation is the thing about the embassies of the different countries in Israel that are going from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, because some evangelicals believe that Israel is the promised land for them. So they put pressure on the foreign policy of different countries to move their embassies to Jerusalem. And so, okay, thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ariel. You're all keeping religiously to your time, which is, I suppose, the appropriate adjective. So now we go to the grassroots with David Simbsler, who is from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and has been doing research on religious life within the asentamientos of the landless workers movement, the MST, in Pernambuco. So, David, over to you.
Thank you. Bom, eu sou francês, mas eu posso falar também português, mas bom, I'm going to speak English. So thank you for inviting me. And my purpose is to take a break from the narrative of evangelical support to Bolsonaro, drawing on my ethnographic research in Pernambuco between 2016 and political crisis. So I hope to give an insight on politics from below, shifting away from religious leaders in institutional politics, as this fieldwork was carried out among the landless movement, o Movimento dos Trabalhadores Rurais Sem Terra, a major actor in contentious politics, who played a key role in resisting the impeachment, in protesting against the imprisonment of Lula and mobilizing for the PT. But my research also gives insight on the institutionalization of this social movement under PT government. So My focus is on evangelical and Pentecostal families from popular classes involved in land reform on sugarcane plantations, the place of birth of colonial Brazil. And this might cause surprise, as our secularist framework of analysis usually don't pay attention to these religious groups in grassroots politics. And despite a vast literature on struggles for land in the Northeast and much research on MST settlements, Pentecostalism is almost never studied, but always mentioned as a problem, a source of conflict. And it's true that land reform settlements in São Paulo or Rio rural zone are full of Pentecostal churches. And very recently, with the European supporters, that they would fight fundamentalism in the settlements. And strangely enough, this term in the French context echoes many public discourses held on Islam, which point at religion as a distinctive otherness. So looking at issues of like space, kinship, and power, I will present briefly 3 points. So the first point is that these mostly Pentecostal people did take part in various protests and collective actions and defend democracy during my fieldwork. This is a protest in Recife. This is a night blockade in Recife too. This is a land occupation when you see people putting up the tents. And well, I will focus on this event with occupying the Praça do Derby during the impeachment. So I show this photo because it's funny. You see that these women are they are with the MST, and they are evangelical from the countryside. And well, they are present in the same space that other movements like Movimento Negro, like Movimento LGBT. But well, we can see that this is an informal worship during this occupation. So we can see that while taking part in such actions, they have also a peculiar relation to space, as they stay apart from the central stage of the praça, holding public discourses from leaders and folk music of the Northeast, like forró and maracatu. So they avoid dancing and drinking and create a sacred space of informal worship as a counterpart of secular polluted spaces. And of course, it's an ethical challenge for them that calls to God's support, but also draw on prophetic biblical narrative with a political dimension, like the struggle for the promised land. The other things too is that they have discipline and self-control, and they engage in material tasks like cooking or building infrastructure, and it's a division of labor which is very useful to collective action, although invisible. So my second point is, well, this is a photograph of during the month of June, which is a famous popular event in the Northeast, Festa de São João, which was celebrated for the MST as a Festa da Colheita. So well, we see this evangelical woman with the MST flags and the products of the land. So what I mean is Pentecostalism was a resource for land occupations as it fostered kinship ties between people. Brazilian social anthropology showed how workers who lived on plantations, the moradores do engenho, have been forced into leaving the land in a process that ended in a dramatic growth of shanty towns all around. And yet, they didn't study how classical Pentecostalism, namely the Assembly of God of Pernambuco, got anchored in this process of uprooting and migrating by missionizing the moradores. And so in the heart of this region, there is a very old congregation that started in the poor house of a morador who converted to Pentecostalism. And today his descendants, thanks to endogamy practices, conversions and marriage with outsiders, still live on the land and are local leaders of this congregation. So the religious ties in Pentecostal churches in town and the good reputation of this well-known family provided a movement of return to the land for these people. Of course, what is meant by kinship ties is reframed and recreated by the spiritual kinship. There is a famous text of Julian Pitt Rivers on grace, the place of grace in anthropology, which is very useful to understand this. So my, the example I wanted to cite was this encampment. They had 90% of evangelicals, and among them 60% had kinship ties between them. So my last point is that the institutionalization of the MST helps to understand conflicts and votes for Bolsonaro in this context. I use this expression, broken promise of land reform, which is taken from a famous book on MST organized by Miguel Carter. So this photo circulated widely on evangelical networks and also newspapers. It was taken by a powerful pastor, deputy, state deputy of the pastor of the Assembly of God. And it was a brand new temple of the Assembly of God was found covered with graffiti the day after the vote. But it was a young MST activist, a son of moradores, whose parents are part of the congregation, who did this. And I find it interesting because it's a reverted figure of intolerance that we used to think of when we think of evangelical in politics. So this young man accused the Assembly of God of supporting Bolsonaro, but my results show that ordinary followers in this zone voted for the PT, who won largely in this rural town. And this, despite the hegemony of the Assembly of God, which is was commemorated his century. It was born 1 century ago, and although the Bolsonaro, the main leaders of the church asked to, others didn't. So in fact, this was a conflict over a strategic space of housing dating back to the plantation. So this is a photo of this space, which is called Arruado, which was the former center of the plantation. And it was a conflict opposing families of moradores because, because power relations with leaders increased after the land was expropriated in 2017. And this was unexpected, but the crisis played a role of, as they say in political science, of structure of opportunity, because Dilma rewarded the MST by signing decrees of expropriation. But instead of the state administration, the MST leaders started to distribute land to some families and not to others, and controlling especially these domestic spaces. And so power relations were perceived as unfair, as a lack of respect, a falta de consideração, as they say. And so one family of the congregation, one family of moradores endorsed de facto Bolsonaro. So, so my conclusion is that how do I get this? So my conclusion is in this context, voting for Bolsonaro was not a simple result of clientelistic strategies of churches, but a protest against the broken promise of land reform, and makes sense in this popular moral framework of reciprocity and search for respect. For them, land is seen as a gift of God for producing family. And most surprising is that whether they voted or didn't vote for Bolsonaro, there was a common perception among them of Bolsonaro as an apocalyptic figure of evil, a sign of the end of time and of divine justice. But this could lead them into voting or not voting. Thank you.
Oh, congratulations. Thank you very much, David. Well, this is, the four of you have presented a wonderful panorama. I hope questions will pop up will cascade onto the Q&A. For the moment, only 2 or 3 people have written in, and their questions have really been answered. But can I just start by asking David briefly, when you say the leaders of the assentamento, that's the local MST leaders, that they penetrate the domestic space of the family, what do you mean? Because they are favoring them with land, or are they going, or is it more profound than that?
Yes, thank you for this question. Yes, it's a bit complicated. I didn't have time to explain it, but there are these remaining families, descendants of this morador, live on what they call a sítio, which was a part of the land that was granted by the landowner, and the others, the moradores, who are really landless compared to these inhabitants of the sítio. They used these remaining houses to build their families, and some MST leaders prevent them from using this housing structure. So it was this this kind of
decisive, yes, yeah. But it sounded as if because the evangelical settlers or asentados have sort of kinship strategy, and they want to make families, they want to get married, that their proportion within the group must be increasing, no?
Yes, of course. Yes, if I had time enough, I could. The people from outside this plantation, a lot of them converted and socialized into this congregation while taking part to the MST activist actions. So,
yeah, well, but anyhow, I think overall the presentations show the diversity of evangelicals. I mean, there are, at the minimum 30, let me think, if the evangelicals are 20% of the Brazilian population, that's 40 million, including everything, mothers and children, but these figures are very vague. So of course, there's going to be a great deal of variation, and we tend to forget that, especially when we're talking about politics. But it's true also that the people who profess to be evangelicals, they do vote to the right more and more, as Amy showed. There was also recently, I saw a research by someone called Victor Araújo, and you may have heard of him, who found, on the basis of similar databases from the Brazilian electoral survey, that lower income people tend to vote what he described as against their interests, thus they not with the PT, and that their religious affiliation to an evangelical church tended to accentuate that tendency. So his article or paper was called "Poor People Vote Against Their Best Interests." But I think we must remember the variety. The other, I think, interesting thing that emerges from this research is the sort of professionalization of politics. I mean, what is a pastor? There were record numbers of people who called themselves pastor in these recent local elections. I think, Amy, you mentioned that, or maybe it was Ana Carolina who mentioned that. And they, but on the other hand, they didn't do particularly well, according to the research that I saw by Cristina Vital. And but the other interesting thing is, I wonder if people are not becoming pastors because they want to go into politics, which is not quite the way we usually think about it. And because if you are a pastor, and then you have to say, well, what is a pastor? Amy talks about clergy, but we have to remember that unlike in the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church, there isn't an authority who's conferring this dignity on anybody, and there isn't an elaborate sort of induction system or training system. So being a pastor is kind of a voluntary. It's a bit like being a rabbi in Israel. As long as you have a beard, you can call yourself a rabbi. And but what I think my main comment on all this issue is, and I want to show you some pictures while I talk, just because I like them, is the institutional penetration. And here we are talking really about neo-Pentecostal churches, the institutional penetration into the political world. Let's say not only are pastors campaigning for particular causes or particular politicians, but the churches are institutionally penetrating in the state, notably by forming political parties. And I'm talking, of course, about the Igreja Universal. They have their own political party. They have their they seem to be, and we don't really have enough documentation or any documentation on this. They make contracts with local governments to provide social services. They claim to have more, I think 170,000 volunteers or something, providing services to lorry drivers, to prostitutes, and so on. This is a very elaborate institutional development, especially in the Universal Church. They also have training systems. They have pastors. I happen to be in Brooklyn at the moment. There's a Universal Church around the corner. Where I live in London, there's also a Universal Church around the corner. In both cases, most of the pastors, well, all the pastors are immigrants, and most of them are from Brazil. They have very good English, so the church must be providing them with training in English. They don't get married on the whole because they are, so to speak, quote unquote, married to the church. So there's a very powerful organizational system here. And it raises, and I conclude with this, I think it does raise the question of the relevance today, because of the way not only neo-Pentecostal religion, but others elsewhere in the world are developing, of our concepts of the secular and of laicidade, because the frontiers which those concepts rely on seem to be crisscrossing and and fraying at the borders all the time. So as a special treat, I'll just conclude with this, these pictures. So here you have the famous Temple of Solomon in Sao Paulo with space for 10,000 people belonging to the Universal Church. It's another view. Note the flags of all the countries of the world. And here you have Bolsonaro.
David, I don't think I can see your image. Is it only me? We can see it.
No,
right?
I don't think you're sharing.
No, I can't see it.
Share screen. Oh, I see what I have to do. Yeah.
Let's see if it goes now.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. So yeah, so this was the first one. I mean, this is just really a distraction. Here you have Bolsonaro, as many of you know, being baptized in the River Jordan. There's a kind of pool in the River Jordan, which is reserved, which has been created by a kibbutz for the benefit of Christians around the world. So it's all set up, they're provided with these words. But he's being baptized by a pastor, is it Evangelisto? Who was a political pastor and is currently indicted for corruption. And many of you, have you seen this image? No comment. And then further, final one. So here you have a gathering at the presidential palace of evangelicals in support of their hero. So that's all. So thank you. Who is orchestrating the questions? Is that you, Andresa, or me?
If you go to the Q&A at the bottom,
Yeah.
and maybe go to open, you see that there are 7 questions. Can you see them? Because I think it's easier if you see them there.
Yeah.
But we
No,
also paste the chat. So we don't have a lot of time. So maybe if you could.
I think you should take over.
Maybe we can briefly address a question to each of the speakers. I think there are enough to go around.
It's in the chat, actually. I've got it in the chat.
Also, yeah.
Yeah, we also copied them there.
Luis Gouveia. Yeah.
He cannot have his mic open, so you'd have to read the question loud.
Okay, so this is in Portuguese. Luis Gouveia diz assim: convergindo com o aumento dos evangélicos nas periferias das grandes cidades, em especial no Rio de Janeiro e nas capitais do Nordeste, as milícias vêm ganhando muito território. Ele pergunta se é possível estabelecer alguma relação entre os evangélicos e as milícias. E se essa relação existe, é de antagonismo ou de suporte. Who is the expert we have on the milícias? I don't know. Have you anything to say, Ana Carolina?
Eu não sou especialista em milícias, mas o que eu acho que posso dizer é que esse é um tema, é uma pergunta muito importante para esse momento. Muitos pesquisadores e antropólogos estão observando essa relação. Existe um estudo da Cristina Vital, inclusive, anterior, um estudo etnográfico que se chama Oração de Traficante, que não está olhando para as milícias, porque está olhando para a estrutura do tráfico, que é distinta nas periferias do Rio de Janeiro, mas eu convido, eu posso escrever aqui a vocês a olharem esse trabalho, que é um trabalho etnográfico ao longo dos anos em Acari, justamente mostrando... Sorry?
Eu estou colocando, continua.
Isso, por favor, obrigada. Justamente mostrando como esse léxico vai mudando, né? A base social, e aí, inclusive a base ligada ao tráfico ou não, vai migrando para símbolos pentecostais, dos católicos para os pentecostais. E acho que essa relação hoje, atual, nas milícias, ela não é direta. Ela existe de alguns grupos, mas a gente não pode fazer essa relação direta. Porque, por um lado, a gente pode generalizar e pode compreender como se a expansão de evangélicos fosse necessariamente negativa, logo ela está ligada às milícias. Ao mesmo tempo, o inverso, a gente precisa entender ali quais são as conexões, e aí por isso que eu gosto de olhar uma separação entre atuação de determinadas lideranças religiosas, seja no território, seja na política, e quais são as diferenças entre a base evangélica, entre a base social evangélica. Porque essas lideranças políticas e também nos territórios, elas são muito mais vocais, elas são muito midiáticas, elas podem nos levar a crer que elas igualam o que a sua base atua, crê, opera. Um pouco, Davi estava falando sobre isso. Então, eu acho que os estudos que estão fazendo geografia na relação dos territórios com as milícias são os mais importantes nesse momento, eu concordo, não tenho essas respostas, só olharia a partir daí, e eu já faço meu último comentário, porque não tem tempo, com algumas perguntas que aconteceram aqui, que é com essa relação da IURD com o PT, de tudo que nós falamos aqui, fica para mim uma grande pergunta, que é como nós explicamos o Lula? Como nós explicamos a relação da base evangélica com os governos anteriores do PT? Como nós explicamos que até o Lula ser proibido de se candidatar em 2018, as pesquisas de intenção de voto dividiam o voto da base evangélica entre o Bolsonaro e o Lula, é importante lembrar isso foi em agosto de 2018. E hoje, quando ele se coloca como candidato novamente, a gente ainda é muito cedo para dizer, porque é a primeira pesquisa presencial com uma amostra pequena, mas mostra que na base evangélica volta a ter uma cisão entre o Lula e o Bolsonaro. Eu não quero centralizar na figura do Lula, estou usando isso só como exemplo, um pouco para a gente ampliar essa lente de quais são os motivadores do voto dessa base evangélica. Eu não gosto de falar em voto evangélico em absoluto, porque é muito generalizante, mas alguma dessa linha do broken promises, como o David falou, é muito importante para entender essa chave, que são broken promises em 2018 também de 16 anos de governo do PT, nessas agendas brasileiras. O voto nessa base evangélica, ele também se direcionou aos broken promises, e não apenas às pautas religiosas. É muito verdade, eu concordo muito com a Amy, que a agenda moral, e ela mostrou isso pelos dados, ela foi muito presente, e esse é um grande desafio, inclusive, para 2018. Como essa base, como esses candidatos mais progressistas, o exemplo do Lula, vai dialogar com um cenário onde, sim, a agenda moral tem um peso onde há 20 anos atrás não tinha. Eu só queria terminar por aqui. Obrigada.
Acho que, até certo ponto, deve-se fazer uma diferença entre milícias e tráfico. Claro que só aqueles que conhecem bem esse meio podem explicar bem, mas infelizmente, tal como o livro da Cristina é bastante único, mas tem também estudos na Centro-América e tem colaborações, não sei se são necessariamente muito ativas, não, mas quando você tem uma igreja pequena, num bairro pobre, onde o tráfico reina, ou tem muita influência, então é muito difícil se opor a eles, né? E os pastores esperam que algum dia um traficante jovem vai se reformar. E na Bahia, uma trabalhadora social me falou assim, no meu bairro, do bairro dela, falou, as igrejas evangélicas estão com o tráfico e a igreja católica está com os cultos afro. Aí é um ex-abrupto, mas dá para pensar, né? Thomas Robinson é o próximo.
David,
yes.
Uma sugestão. In the interest of time, what about if you pass to each panelist, and they do just like Ana Carolina did, as they answer a couple of questions that they feel they can engage with, and then they make their final considerations.
Okay, so I don't have to translate or read it out?
No, you just hand the floor to...
Okay, so next. Ariel, have you any comment on the questions that you see in front of you? Maybe you can say whose questions they are.
Okay. No, I just wanted to say that I just wanted to highlight that the broken situation between the Workers' Party, PT, and the evangelical pastors, especially, that used to travel in the same plane with Lula, with President Lula, Lula. Was important the nomination of the pastor Marco Feliciano as the president of the Commission of Human Rights in the Chamber of Deputies in the Congress. So when he in 2014 was nominated to that presidency, he started a very conservative speech, and he had the support of Bolsonaro. And in that
Marco,
same,
you mean a Marcos Feliciano?
Marco Feliciano, yes. I don't know what I said, but I mean Marco Feliciano. But that same year, on 2014, the pastor Everaldo launched his candidacy for the presidency with the slogan "Privatiza Tudo." So, in 2014, I think it was one more important time to realize about this broken situation between the alliance of the PT and the Evangelicals. I think that one of the most important issues was the moral agenda, the gender agenda that it was more progressive that the PT started to implement, but it was rejected by the conservative pastors in the Congress. And also the June mobilizations that eroded the support that Dilma Rousseff had. So the pastors in the Congress started to see that she was not a good candidate to support again. So that's everything.
The Pastor Everaldo is the one who went to the River Jordan with Bolsonaro, no?
Yes.
Yeah, not Evaristo, Everaldo. Yeah. Good. Amy?
Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to answer just one question. Thomas Robinson, I see that you have a lot of questions here that I would be delighted to answer if you want to send me an email. And yeah, you and I can have an email conversation about them. I'm going to very quickly answer Jorge Alves's question because it touches on a topic that we haven't discussed yet. So Jorge Alves basically asks what's going on with Catholics and why aren't they getting involved in politics? My 2019 book deals with both evangelicals and Catholics. The very short answer in like 1 minute is that Catholics are getting involved in politics. They are, so you can think of these in terms of what are Catholic interests? Catholic interests are first the sort of institutional interests, and they also have ideological interests. In terms of institutional interests, Catholics have long been the dominant force in Brazil. It is effectively a form of monopolist of religious monopolist. They had it was the Church of State up until the late 19th century, and continues to have privileges. So Catholic interests are best preserved in different ways than evangelical interests are, because Catholics can do things behind the scenes and through their large cultural repertoire and ownership of buildings and infrastructure, ownership, like effectual sort of intellectual ownership of things like the image of the Cristo Redentor, the Christ the Redeemer statue. So there are all kinds of ways that Catholics have cultural and political power that enables them to exercise leverage that evangelicals did not come onto the political scene with. As far as ideological interests, Catholics have ideological interests, but they are more split and diverse, which is one reason you don't see one single Catholic political party, because it would be hard to define what Catholics want. Also, the global Catholic Church believes that its political interests are better preserved through things other than running for office. I'm going to be quiet there. Thank you guys so much for such a rich and interesting panel, and I would be happy to answer questions over email.
Thank you. I mean, it is striking how the voice of the Catholic Church has been almost inaudible, even during that very vicious campaign in 2017, I think the bishops' conference didn't even put out a statement saying, calling on people to calm things down. So there's a big change there. Yeah. Next, David.
Yeah.
Have you anything more to say?
Yeah, I saw there's a question addressed to me on the, where is it? On the LGBT Saint Terre.
Yeah.
The prominence of the LGBT movement within the MST and how the interaction. So as I tried to show on the photo, there is an interaction, but distanced, and well, the problem is the MST is very diverse, divided between activists who are increasingly urban, educated students, young, and with this LGBT culture, which don't have persons from the countryside. And I think that's more than a cultural or moral gap. It's a matter of a social one. And but for example, during the elections, I heard a very old, respected leader of the local Assembly of God saying that sexuality is a matter of free choice, just like choosing Jesus. So, and this is also discourse in the LGBT Evangelical Church. Yeah? But you see, there is I think it's more a question of social gap than a cultural one.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, do we have to finish now, Andres, or do we still have time?
Yeah, we passed the time already, a few minutes, so we should finish, unfortunately.
So will you close the meeting? Yes,
I actually have a few words to close the meeting because I never know how to finish, so let me open it. Yeah, I do have problems to concentrate on what I have to say, and I have to present the next panel, so sorry. I'd like to really thank everyone who watched us, and I hope you can come back here next Wednesday. We have another panel called Uncertainty and Fragmented Policy Strategies, the Pandemic in Brazil, and I think Katrina will tell us a little bit more of who is going to be in the panel.
Yeah, so next week's panel will focus on political implications in a context characterized by uncertainties and denialism. And our panelists will be Glajimir Arolgi, Lorena Barberia, Elaine Nascimento, and Andresa, who is the organizer of this conference. Yes. So just before closing, I would like to thank you again all for these very exciting presentations. I think it was a very diverse and thought-provoking discussion. And thanks to everyone who attended this as well. Unfortunately, we didn't have time for all the questions to be answered, but as some of the speakers already mentioned, feel free to send them an email and maybe continue this conversation at a later point. So thank you again for watching, and hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.